On today's episode of the Unveil Podcast, I sit down with Cole Berschback. Now, this is an audio-only podcast because I had some serious technological issues, for which I apologize. But this conversation was so fruitful and filled with insights and inspiration that I absolutely had to publish it on the podcast. Now, Cole Berschback is co-founder of Total Potential, an author, Unbeatable Mind Coach, registered dietitian, a certified yoga instructor. She's also the mum of 3 incredible kids and married to her favorite human. She has spent the past 20 years working in health and wellness. Several formative events led to a deep passion for families and all that is possible when we approach the family as an opportunity, not an obstacle. She supports group and one-to-one coaching to help individuals experience the best of themselves with the people they love most. Now, we dig into all of that on this episode. As many of the listeners will know, I am not in a relationship and I don't have children. So this was fascinating for me to dig into my beliefs about relationships and parenting and how my view on that has been influenced by the society's impression that parenting and having children is all uphill hard work. Cole turns that on its head and really respects the unit of the family. And she shares with us insights and inspiration for people who are already parents, people who are contemplating becoming parents, and she delivers practical tips on how to make your family unit the nourishing resource and plentiful opportunity that it is. I really hope you enjoy this episode. All of the links to where you can find Cole will be in the show notes. Please go and give her a follow and tell her how much you enjoyed listening to her stories on today's Unveil Podcast. So, welcome to the Unveil Podcast, Cole Berschback.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for having me. I'm really glad to be here with you.
Yes, and people will work this out later, that this is the second time we've recorded this little introduction bit. I will tie it all together for everyone in post, as we were just saying, but thank you so much for making time again because of my technical difficulties, the rare thunderstorm in Austin, Texas, and the whole thing exploded. But we are here and I get to talk to you again and just have this little introduction that we will tie into the remainder of the podcast. So thank you so much.
It is so my pleasure. I feel like I kind of lucked out. I get to talk to you twice. So it's working out just fine for me.
Oh, bless. That's very sweet. So we're going to do again the introduction that we did last time. And I really want to give our listeners a full flavor of what you do at Total Potential. So why don't you explain that to me in terms of what you do, how it came about? Just give us a flavor of what you do.
Yeah. So what we do is provide resources and coaching for people who are looking to develop themselves in the context of their marriage and family, which, gets kind of convoluted because we always say like, we're better together. Like the unit functioning together is the most important part. But the fact of the matter is you can't really influence that unit if you're not doing the work yourself.
Yeah.
So we really, focus as far as the coaching that we do more on that internal experience and environment, clearing up the things that you need to take care of so that you can be intentional in the way you show up in your marriage and your family. So the coaching, lots of resources. We're not the only people who provide resources. We are lucky to share a podcast with lots of wonderful people who, share insights that we are not as familiar with, as well as different resources, like in our family section, we have resources from, developmental psychologists and education specialists and lots of different people who bring just this extra little flavor of bits of knowledge that people can really use to transform the way they interact with their family. So those are some of the things you can find through Total Potential. And how we got there is a long and curvy road.
It's always though, aren't
Yes.
all good roads long and curvy?
Yes. And I think, there's a couple of really formative things that led to this development of wanting to even begin Total Potential. And both my brother and I had, and I do Total Potential with my brother, which as a family business works out just like so delightfully for the two of us.
Yep.
We both had these crossroads where something landed and it didn't land super well, or I'll share a little bit about my own experience, but we were having this round and round conversation of like, we both want to be on this path. We both want to become that thing that we feel like we're called to become. That's past just the checklist of, yeah, I did this and I got that job and I built that house or whatever. Like it just became uninteresting, those, kind of like life checkmark sort of things. But then we were having the conversation of, okay, great. So you can do all of those things and I can go to the gym for 3 hours and I'm going to look rad when I leave. But like, that would be at the sacrifice of my family. Like if I'm at the gym for 3 hours, who's with the kids?
Yeah.
And so we're having this round and round conversation of like, where are the resources to support people in real life who are raising kids and want to be with those children and with their spouse instead of separate.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that was a huge part. We're like, it's not out there and we can't find it. And we're looking everywhere for it.
Yeah.
Like, let's rally the troops. Let's make this happen. Let's find the experts. Let's, we both have a lot of health and wellness background. Like, let's use what we have and bring that to people who really need it. So that's how we got started, was just this ongoing conversation of, okay, we want this, but how the heck do you do this without literally imploding your family along the way?
Yeah. And it's so interesting because it's not, as someone who is single and without a family, it's not something that I would think would be needed because it just doesn't come into my landscape. But the moment I kind of came across you and I saw what you do, I was like, oh yeah, there's this real need to make family living functional and healthy without it being a problem or an imposition or like difficult.
Right. Without it being difficult, without it being an obstacle to what feels like your endpoint, without it feeling just conditioned, like you're just like reliving a story that you are familiar with, but that you're actually opting into a story that feels empowering and like yours, and that you're in charge and making the choices of. And that's not actually that easy to do.
Right. Right.
So we're like, we got to support people to like really get in there and get your hands dirty and get creative and curious and, develop what really makes sense for you and your family. Like there's nothing cookie cutter about any family.
Yeah.
So how do you ask a question, even just one question, where it's like you can turn inside and find your own answer?
Right. And so what sort of people do you find are coming to Total Potential? Is it the whole spread of everything? Because you just mentioned there's no cookie cutter. I mean, I imagine having like an insight into the families that come to you, there must be sort of a demographic, or is it really, really broad?
It is fairly broad, but most of our audience are people who have like toddler, usually the youngest, right? When you have your first baby, you're still kind of like in la la land of like trying to figure it all out, let alone like, oh, I'd like to be super intentional about this. So most people's youngest kiddo is around toddler, but we have a lot of families who are in those school age, just like busy, moving, active ages. And I think what we find is that, you get through that initial stage of parenting and it's so all in when you have that little of kids that I think sometimes it's hard to see the forest for the trees, right? Just to like come out for a deep breath sometimes. But once you get into a little bit of a rhythm and a little bit of a schedule and your kids have a little bit more independence, it's often surprising. Like, oh, this feels different than I was expecting, or it doesn't feel as fulfilling maybe as I was expecting.
Yeah.
I don't feel like the person I want to be in relation to this family. So it tends to be that age where these things kind of start to come to the surface.
Interesting.
And those tend to be our people.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and I was the kid that was doing a million and one after school things. And I think my mom turned into a chauffeur for like a good solid amount of my childhood, with myself and my brother just being ferried from one place to the next.
Yeah.
Like, you're not a family. You're just a set of task lists and a calendar, basically.
Yeah. And that doesn't feel that good for a lot of people.
No. And I love that you have these resources that kind of can really provide people with the thing that they need. So we will put your website in the show notes, obviously, but when you just dip into the website, it's like there's a million and one things, and there's so much that people can be interested in and might need to resource their family. So I love the fact that you create the spread for people to just find their way through.
Yeah. Yeah. Because if you have a family who maybe isn't pursuing a quote unquote standard education,
Sure.
that can feel really alone, right? So we talk to people who do schooling differently, and we talk to school psychologists who help support kiddos through, maybe a non-traditional environment in a traditional school. Like those are real challenges for a lot of families.
Right. Yeah.
So, and we're not the experts, right? So we go out and find the people who know what they're talking about in those areas so that we can, even if it's just like spark the one idea of like, ooh, somehow I have the power now. Somehow I have the choice.
Yeah.
That's what we really want to give families.
Yeah. And transforming that perspective from like empowering rather than it being just a hard thing that you're kind of stuck with. Now you've got these kids that you really wanted, but somehow it just doesn't feel good anymore.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
And
did
I've
you
been
like-
there too.
Well, and that's it. So obviously, you have 3 kids now, right?
Yes.
So did this start with your first, or was it like when you had more than one where it was like, hang on a second, this isn't working? When was the kind of moment?
I definitely had some ahas with my first because I had wanted to be a mom literally my whole life. Like I don't recall a time in my life where I wasn't excited to be a mother. And so, I had my first son and he's magic and wonderful. My husband was in residency. Like we had some things kind of working against us in terms of like creating some ease with parenting. Um, but I have this little guy and I just feel tapped out all the time. Like I feel drained. I feel like I hardly recognize myself. Like there were just all these sensations that as somebody who had wanted to be a mom their whole life, I was like, this is not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
And so there was definitely, wake ups and kind of like, oh, something's happening here right away. But then once I had all 3 kiddos and I felt like, okay, I'm through the phase of I wasn't a super well feeling pregnant person. So I was like, okay, I'm through the phase of, all the wake ups at night. I'm through getting sick while I'm pregnant. Like I'm through those things that I knew were going to feel hard. And then I'm like, this still like, I want this to feel delicious every day. And it doesn't, it feels hard. It feels exhausting. Like, and that disconnect for me felt it felt like the Grand Canyon, like because I had this very clear picture of what I was hoping and wanting to feel as a mom versus what I did feel as a mom. And that, yeah, it didn't land super well. So I just, like go in the deep end and figure it out.
And I love that because most people would just be like, oh, this doesn't quite match up to what my expectation was. Oh, well, that sucks. Let's just get on with it and just make it this kind of slog, this repetitive, like Groundhog Day slog. I love your approach of just like, okay, so there's an expectation gap here. Let's make it feel fabulous. Let's dig in and make it feel amazing.
Yeah. Well, and I knew there had to be something like, how do you have this literal like call to your soul to do something and then you do it and there's this mismatch? It would be so different if I had just landed on being a mom, or maybe it was unexpected, or it didn't feel as much of a choice. Maybe it felt like something I was just quote unquote supposed to do, but that wasn't where I was coming from.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was shocking to my system. And I was like, we got to figure this out. Cause I can't look back when my kids are grown and have felt that way about being a mom. Like it just can't.
Oh yeah. That's such an interesting thing of like fast forwarding to like when they're grown and gone and you basically just resented the last 18 years of your life almost.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Like wished it away. I'm like, I can't, there's no way I'm not wishing this away. Yeah.
Did you notice like a big upsurge in people approaching kind of your services during COVID out of interest? I was just thinking about like all the homeschooling that people were doing. It's just like, I mean, that's like nuclear bomb of explosion in family units.
Yeah. You know what? It's been super interesting to see what people have needed and or become aware of because of the pandemic, because all of a sudden, if you were the type of family, and I say this without any judgment whatsoever, but if you were the type of family who like all day, every day is scheduled and your kids are here and they're there and they're busy and that went away, like your whole way of being changed, right? And so all the things you were hiding from by having that lifestyle were like right here.
Yeah.
And so what are the tools and resources that you need to like control your internal environment so that you aren't raging at your kids you know what I mean? Like, so the change in lifestyle that came about from the pandemic and the way families suddenly were operating, I think just struck this like brand new awareness in families that society historically has said like busy is the best way to be. So like get a move on. And that became so untrue so fast.
Yes. Yeah, like overnight.
Literally overnight.
Yeah.
And then people were like, oh, well, wait, well, and for some people it was too hard, right? They like kind of retreated and that's okay. Like that's just your system finding a way to stay safe.
Yeah.
But for a lot of people, they're like, oh, I don't like this. What do I do about it?
Right.
And that's where, so many new conversations have come up because people feel like they have a choice now that wasn't maybe as obvious before.
Yeah. And I heard so many people say, oh, this has been the best time because I got to spend it with my family. But I'm sure that was one experience. And the other experience was, wow, now we are literally face to face with the reality of what we've been, as you said, like avoiding with just this overscheduled from partners as well as children. And it's the whole thing in one house and you literally can't leave. It must have just been like a massive mirror up to people's realities.
Yeah. Talk about embracing the discomfort, right?
Right.
There was a lot of it and every day was different. And there was a lot that surfaced, especially in the family unit, because we had to connect in new ways. And if it was uncomfortable to connect, just being in each other's presence, or just asking your kids some questions, or just going outside to play in the yard, there was a lot of work to do. That in and of itself was uncomfortable. And for the vast majority of people, that was uncomfortable after like 1 week. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And that discomfort, if you're feeling it as the parent, you can't not influence the kids and the whole unit. And I love what you say. It's like, yes, we're focused on a family unit, but you can only work on yourself in that.
Yeah, because otherwise, every interaction you're bringing that cloud. And I don't mean cloud as in necessarily dark, because some things we do in an unconscious way that are really good and positive. But you bring this lack of understanding and lack of awareness into every interaction until you decide to start to recognize it, right? So, I mean, it's like there are some things we do and they're awesome for our kids. But until we wake up to what we actually do and why we do it and what's the driver and where's the button and what's the trigger and whatever, it's really hard to make a conscious choice how to show up as a parent. So that's can't take care of the home until you take care of home base is always kind of my start here.
Yeah.
And then it gets to go up.
Yeah. I love that. Here is where the audio is about to change and the quality will drop slightly, but you will still be able to get an enormous amount of value from what Cole goes on to share with me on this podcast. Thank you for your patience this week, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the podcast. I'm obsessed with the nervous system, and you just like alerted something in me where if I'm a parent and I'm squeezing myself into a box and approaching the whole element of parenting with frustration, that has a bleed effect onto the child that I'm trying to parent so much. So all of this liberation is almost allowing the children to be in a much safer environment for their evolution themselves, where they can become these, children who just shock and surprise and give you gifts every day that don't always come wrapped up in pretty little bows, but can completely like rock your world in the best of ways. Because I'm a big believer in that children are there to support the evolution of the community, actually, the whole community.
Yes.
Yeah. I love that. So how many children do you have now?
I have 3 kids. They're 15, 11, and 9.
How's it going?
It's going great. I just thank my lucky stars because they're really remarkable. They're super different from one another. And so like the amount to learn from them is even greater because they are so vastly different. It's been really special to see their bond because they're really close with one another, which as a mom means a great deal to me. Yeah, they're just super interesting. I mean, my oldest is like your, kind of classic like student athlete, but then my next guy, like yesterday, he's like, "Mom, can you become a teacher of quantum physics?" And I'm like, "I think you can."
Oh my goodness. Good luck keeping up with that one.
I know. I'm like, "You're going to have to teach me a few things."
Right.
But
oh, that's wonderful.
It's really different.
And I think that's what happens when you haven't, I'm guessing and I'm kind of projecting, but I'm assuming you haven't forced anything onto your children because you've let them emerge and become who they want to be. And so you see the difference. You see that you've got these 3 unique archetypes of human and emerging in front of your eyes.
Yeah. And it's kind of to the assumption you made about, not like forcing them. One of the more interesting things that has happened with myself as a mom, specifically with one of my children, is my daughter is like a very highly sensitive person. And I don't mean like, she feels what she feels.
Yeah.
She's not trying to hide anything. And she actually has been my biggest learning lesson because we had a very narrow window of things that we should feel and could feel. And she doesn't abide by that rule. She feels the whole gamut, every single bit of it. And so there's just so much to learn from her by her being in tune to that and not stamping it out. And that's something I've had to be so mindful of because, all person, it can feel like a lot. But I think what a gift it is as she becomes an adult and interacts with other people, what a gift it is for her to actually feel what she feels and not have no idea what's going on with her. Like, what a gift.
Oh, I've got chills right now. I literally have chills because I'm a coach who sees people who always have been highly sensitive, feeling all the feelings, but have been shown time and again that their feelings were for some reason not okay to be experiencing in that moment in time by their parents. No judgment, like people don't know how to manage this, but and by society and we have like 4 words for feelings, but if you actually like Google feeling words, like there's a heck of a lot of feeling words, and particularly as a Brit, we've got so many great words for feelings because like it's a repressed society. So we needed to create words. But it's so wonderful to feel that there is a change happening within the generation of parents that are around now, where we get that it isn't just about saying, well, you're a child, therefore you occupy this space. But it's like you're a child, you take up as much space as you need to, where you get to explore your edges and really understand you. Because that's empowering them to be a human that is worth being around as an adult, rather than a human that's going to end up at my door saying, I need help, which is phenomenal.
Right. Yeah. And, this is an area where I find myself needing to give myself a little bit of grace, right? Because I had like a really blissful, wonderful childhood, but it had these parameters that I wasn't aware of. And so as an adult, have been like, oh, wow, there's some undoing to do. And if I could just give my kids like a, 5 or 10 year head start on that, would be like, I would be so happy as a mom. Like, okay, I saved you at least 5 years of, trying to figure stuff out after you're an adult and, have a fully developed brain. Like that feels like a gift to give my kids.
Oh, and how? I mean, goodness. I'm currently training in somatic experiencing and just being with people who are, you're trying to get into sensations, and there are certain people who can do it, and we're really in touch with the felt sense of the emotionality, and we can describe it, and then people who just can't. And the on-ramp, and I see that in my clients, I see that in the people who are training around me, and I'm like, there is such a narrowing that happens or can happen, and any kind of margin of widening that so that people can experience more of their wholeness is a privilege. It is a gift. And so it sounds like you're doing a phenomenal job, especially with the difference, because it must be very easy as a parent to think, oh, I've done it once, second time will be a breeze. It's like,
and that's why the third one is the one who's giving me all the surprises, right? Because I'm definitely still learning. Yeah. There's a lot from her.
Yeah, but it's clear that you're enjoying the process of being educated by your children. And I think that that's really important. It's like an important essence that I'm getting from you. It's like we don't go into parenting thinking we know it all, even if we've read all the books.
And if you go into parenting thinking you know it all, it's going to feel horrible every day because you know nothing. I mean, we're raising other human beings. Like, I think about this all the time, like even in relationship to my husband, like we overturn our whole body of cells, like within a few years' time. Like I'm not the same. My kids are not going to be the same. And from day to day, they're not going to be the same. Like if we go into anything feeling like, I got that figured out. Like, literally parenting's going to feel terrible because you don't have anything figured out. And that's the gift of it. That's not the obstacle. That's where all the beauty is, where all the possibility is in the unknowing, and just being willing to be curious with yourself, with your kids, with your spouse, with the whole group together. That's where all of the awesomeness sort of like emerges out of.
That's phenomenal. And I'm interested, given the ages of your children, have you seen a difference in their social groups and the way the world is around them from your 15-year-old to your youngest? Is there kind of a difference, or is that too short a time horizon? I'm just fascinated by the way society is evolving at the moment and the social media world and all that. So I'd be really interested in your opinion.
Yeah. I think my kids, for better or worse, I don't know if they would agree with this, but they've been shielded from it a little bit because I have been super anti-social media. And for them, whatever, we're on social media. That's the way the world works. But I didn't let my oldest, he's going to be a sophomore in high school, I didn't let him get a phone until he was 14. And so he was the last person by years to have access to that. But the thing I really see shifting is how really young children in their peer groups have access to devices and technology and social media platforms and those kinds of things. And my alarm bells just like fire at all levels. But that is a noticeable difference. I mean, like my daughter's going into the 4th grade and a lot of her friends have access, their own access to technology at will. So that's a big difference in just a few years' time.
And I feel like it's getting faster. Yeah, I feel like the whole speed of this. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, I was very young having a phone, but like it was a brick that could make calls and play Snake. It wasn't like the world was not in my hand at 13 or whatever. And it just, I'm part of the generation where everything changed, where we started by handwriting our essays, and then by the end of school we were, typing them, and that. It feels very much like I'm lucky in that I get to bridge, but I don't think I could be a child or a teenager in this world that we're living in right now. I don't know that it's healthy on any level with the kind of speed of the social media dopamine hit universe.
Yeah, the technology piece is really interesting, but it's also they don't know anything. They have no other reference point. It's all they know, and I actually think in a lot of ways their relationship to it is a little bit different than ours because it is so pervasive and it's so accessible that it's got a different flavor for them than I think it did for, some of the generations before. But the thing that strikes me about the way technology influences young people now is how vastly more important connection is, especially in the family unit, because that's if their time outside of the family or even in the family is connecting, quote unquote, with people on the internet or on TikTok, like watching TikTok or whatever. I mean, we all know that's not real connection. And so that's where my alarm bells go. Like, how do you have families turn back into themselves so that they have this like baseline of connection and safety? Because that's there's so many things you see in technology that really make a child's brain feel unsafe. Like, I'm not good enough. I'm not sure. I don't know where I fit. I don't have the same, X, Y, or Z that I'm seeing. And so that to me is what makes the family like ever so much more important now than maybe ever before. Because, kind of circle back what we said earlier, the grandparents don't live down the street. You might only have your nuclear family that you have access to. And if that family relationship revolves around like driving in the car, but everyone's on their phone the whole time, there's zero, like actually no connection. And that's where my heart just like, because that's our fault. That's not our fault. That is our fault.
Yeah. So, and there's no safe place for them to land if that's the case. And I feel like almost everything would be everything in the social media world, which can be scary and overwhelming, if the child has the ability to come to the parents and like check it, like have a reference point, have a support structure, have somebody they can go to and say, I'm seeing this, what do you think, or whatever it is, then there's a balance to it all. But I do see so many kids who their world is in a little black plastic box called a telephone, and it's like there's no ability to feel into any sense of safety within human connection in the same room.
Yeah. And I really don't have any judgment. We're all trying to do the very best with what we have. But I also see a lot of families where it's almost like preferred that that's how the children are because it's easier, because they're not quote unquote in the way. They're not asking for anything. They're not messing the house up. They're not, whatever. But again, that's on us. That's not on our kids. And like, I'd much rather live in a house that looks like an explosion happened than feel like I'm turning my child over to like the care of the internet, right? Because that's very, very place.
Yeah. Oh, totally. And I know. So give us a little peek into your kind of world, if you feel okay. Are you the kind of family who does regular family dinners? Is every night around the table? What's your kind of policies? How do you instill this connection? So give our listeners a bit of a take home of, okay, so how do we get back to that connection of the family? And what are the few essentials you found that really make that a rooting place of home?
Yeah. So there's a couple of buckets that I think of, like as very simple and common places to connect that I can speak to from my own family have been massive for us. One is the family meal, to your point. And granted, I have I'm a dietitian by training. I love to cook. Like that's a special space for me. But that's for me a non-negotiable, like 90% of the time. I mean, every once in a while, right? Like we're off and it just doesn't quite happen. But family meals are a big thing for us. The other thing is just playfulness. What board game do you want to play? What card game do you want to learn? What game do you want to go outside and play? Like just being in that playful space where there's no expectation of anything specific happening. I mean, that's where we come up with our funniest stories. That's when we share the funniest. Like that's been a really positive space for us. And the last place is the car. And I know that's crazy, but as parents of 3 young children, we spend a lot of time in the car, whether it's driving to school or soccer practice or whatever it is. And I take responsibility for this in that area, but I'm like a question machine. Like, hey, what do you think about this that happened? Or if you could go on your dream vacation, where would you go? Like, just, I don't need to extract anything from them. I'm not trying to find out like who's dating who at school. I don't really care, but just like the openness to engage with them. And yeah, those 3 things have been. We also are like really connected to a Christian faith, and that's been a like baseline area of connection for us as well, whether that's celebrating traditions or going to church or whatever it is. But yeah, so those things have been some of our best places for connection.
I love that. And I love what you said about you're not trying to extract anything, because it feels very much like sometimes if you get in the car and it's like, this is the time where you ask the kids the difficult questions. It's like there's so much tension just going into that. Whereas I feel like if it's just the culture that we chat, you are creating that open floor where if there is stuff to talk about, your kids are going to volunteer it because you've had the conversation about the, just dream holiday and the, whatever memory or the favorite roller coaster ride or whatever. And then suddenly they're talking to you about something that is deep and meaningful because it's just an open floor, which I love. And I so love the car thing because we spend so much time in our cars. So
much. Yeah. My oldest son's getting his driver's license in November, and he keeps referencing like, oh, Mom, this is the last soccer season that you're going to have to bring me to practice. And, he keeps making these points. And I try to encourage him because he's really excited about having his driver's license. But I said to him the other day, I said, buddy, in a lot of ways, I'm actually dreading you having your license because school's 5 minutes away and soccer practice is 5 minutes away, but those are 5 minutes that I get with you guaranteed every single day. And now that time is not going to be the same. And I'm actually really sad about it. I'm glad you're excited. And, there's times it's going to be convenient, but I'm dreading actually not having the car time with him.
And how did he take that out of interest? Was he interested?
He was really surprised because I think he thinks it feels like life is easier once he's driving. But then he said he went through and like counted the minutes of, an approximate day of driving around. And he was like, oh, wow. He's like, yeah, so like 25 minutes a day where we do just talk and now you're not going to have that. And I'm like, yeah. And just so you know, like I'm mindful of where else does 25 minutes come from if it doesn't come from the car time, right? So it'll be exciting actually to what are the new ways that we connect? What are the new paths? What are the new spaces that we for sure are connecting on a day-to-day basis?
I adore that, because even just you sharing that shows your orientation to everything as an evolution, and it's not I'm losing this, it's what can develop now that this you get a bit of time, you get maybe 25 minutes. I mean, I'm sure there's other kids happening and all that kind of stuff, but you get a little bit of like space without that, and he gets a bit of independence, and then what is he going to bring back into your unit with the difference and the evolution that he's going through, which just feels like such a healthier way to look at stuff, rather than this kind of, oh, I'm dreading my empty nest syndrome or whatever it is that parents say. It's just like, well, I'm sure that comes, and I'm sure there's those gaps, but always orienting to the, okay, this is growth, this is change, this is possibilities of potential for the future, feels like a healthier place to exist from, basically.
Yeah, and it helps you live in the present moment. I mean, something that's really, I understand why so many people feel this way, but so many people become nostalgic for what was. And I understand that, but it's not what is. And so, like, let's just be right here, right now, and enjoy exactly what's in front of us, because that's what life is giving us. Like, I don't want to fight something that's back there. I just,
Well, and this is the only place we can be. Yeah, and I love that. And I just, sorry, I interrupt you. This is Zoom kind of really cut over people, but I love what you just made, because like everywhere else that you are, you're only there with your mind, can physically only be there with your mind. The only place you can be with your cellular makeup of this present moment is the present moment. And as you said earlier, like, I'm now a different set of cells than I was when I said that previous sentence, and I will be, and I will be. So this is the only place I can exist. And I think we are always time traveling as human beings. We're always projecting into the future, or like remembering the past. And to an extent, I think our minds have that function where we need to prepare for potentials. But when it comes to connection, especially with connection, you're connecting with your whole human self. So this is the only place you can do that, right here, right now, in this moment. And like getting to almost luxuriate in the 5-minute rides that you have left with your son, rather than always focusing on the time when you're going to not have that 25 minutes of connection day, is definitely the kind of healthier place to exist from, I think.
The final book chapter in our book is on contentment. And for this exact reason, because the only place to be content is right here, right now. And it's the hardest thing to do by far, but it's where all of the joy is, where all of the contentment is. Like, it's all right here. And until we train ourselves to be able to be right here and slow the mind, and it's really hard to find that contentment and the peace and the joy that lives right here if I just allow myself to be here. And the beauty of doing this work in family is that our kids have it.
Yeah.
They are present. And of course, that shifts as they grow, but especially with young children, you want to see a kid be right here, right now. Like, they'll jump in a puddle and coat themselves in mud. Like, they are nowhere else other than right here.
Yeah.
And so being able to honestly let them model that and we follow it is a really cool opportunity that's unique to family.
Yeah, and I love that, because I think that we always think, oh, we're the grown-ups, we're the ones teaching. It's like, I learned so much from watching how kids relate to me. So I've done a lot of like personal work, and there was a distinct moment sometime last year where I've always had this thing where kids are a bit wary of me, and I don't know why. I love kids. I would happily hold a baby, but I always felt uncomfortable in my own skin. And there was a distinct moment, and I was living in South Africa, and there was this little kid who was about 4, called Victor, and my name's Victoria, blonde, curly locks, like just classic South, and he just absolutely adored me. And it was so specific, because I'd done a lot of work and I'd had a lot of changes, and this kid came up to me and was different, noticeably different in my presence. And it was like, oh, it wasn't ever I can't do children. It was I wasn't doing me well enough to be able to be met by a totally innocent nervous system without creating some kind of friction. And as I finally settled into things, this kid was just so, I mean, he didn't care that I was this crazy British woman. He just wanted to play with me. He wanted to teach me games. He wanted to take me places. He wanted me to be with him on the walks. And I was just his neighbor. We had this shared connection point, and we had similar birthdays as well. And it was just that energy of like, and I still remember this kid, and like, he will probably be carried with me for a good long time, because I really saw from him that how I showed up had to match him, not the other way around. And that, from a kind of energy allowing perspective, felt like a very deep lesson from this cute little 4-year-old.
Yeah. They're good teachers, man. They know what's up. Yeah, it's beautiful. I love that story.
I'm kind of like really needing children now. This is like, I should never have these conversations, because like every time I do talk to someone who's like on the right side of parenting, I'll put it, and that's not to, again, as you said, not to be judgmental, but who's making it sound like a joy and an experience of growth and mutual kind of like evolution, I'm like, oh, I need this. Mm-hmm. But then you talk to people like, oh my God, it's hard. This one did this and this one did this, and I can't even believe what that one did. And I'm like, that just sounds like work.
Yeah. And unfortunately, and that's why we're trying to be the weirdos, because that is what's normalized, that it's super hard, that kids are in the way, and that you're basically trying to train them into adults. And there's just something really different that's available if you have the space in yourself to open your mind a little bit to even like the slightest bit of possibility that there is something that could be different.
Yeah. I love that. And I want to just ask you a couple of questions with my kind of functional medicine hat on. These may go nowhere, and I'm okay with that if that's what happens. But obviously, with your history as a dietitian, I deal a lot with parents of children, young children, who are particularly fussy around food and things like that. And as you've mentioned, meals, and I have a big digestive health history, problems with my digestive system. I'm a really passionate believer in that kind of coming togetherness of nourishing oneself and nourishing oneself as a family. Do you have any experience with fussy eaters or difficult children, or any advice on this score? Because I want to try, I'm kind of like, I want all of your goodies and information, because I hear it so often.
Yes. So a couple of pieces of background that kind of help frame this up. Number one, I worked in a cystic fibrosis clinic. That was the last job I had in a hospital. And people with cystic fibrosis have a lot of digestive issues. And especially with kids, they quote unquote need to eat. They need to eat a lot. They need to eat well, because they need to grow and have big lungs, right? Because that's what's going to help them live long. And so that gave me this whole audience of basically like 0 to 5-year-olds that I could see like all these different family dynamics and how food was presented and what the beliefs around food were. So that was one area. Yeah. And then here I am, a dietitian working in pediatrics, and my oldest son, had, as it turned out, a fairly significant sensory disorder, and it was really impacting his food choices. Yeah. And so I'm like, okay, same thing, right? It's like, what's the lesson here? Like, clearly this is coming into my life for a reason. Yeah. And so there's a few things that were huge learning lessons for me, and have been huge learning lessons for other people that I've worked with, which is that, number one, meal times are a time of connection. They are not a time of to-do. They are not a time of setting up, like waging war against each other because somebody needs to eat. Like, the more space there is at a meal, as a parent, I love Ellen Statter's philosophy of like, our job is to provide healthy, like good food choices at regular times in regular locations, right? And everything else is up to the kid. And that has been a very useful philosophy. Mm-hmm. The other thing is to turn food into play. When we think about food, our thought is always that trying it means that you took a bite, chewed it, and swallowed it. And for a lot of kids, that's like 10 steps into trying a food, right? Maybe the first step is that they grab it off the grocery shelf or put it away in the refrigerator. Yeah. Maybe the next step is that they're willing to like cut it up when you're preparing it for a meal. Maybe then they're going to smell it. I mean, there's all these different things that kids do to explore and learn about food that have nothing to do with actually ingesting a bite of it. And the more they can explore it and feel safe with food, especially for kiddos who are picky eaters, that's like a complete game changer for a lot of kids.
I'm so delighted to ask you this question, and I'm actually finding myself quite emotional as you're talking, because so many people are very food must be eaten, and I'm like, food stuffs must be experienced. Like, it's a sensory process, and there's a lot of negative dialogue about, you know, emotional eating in adults in particular, and it's like, well, that's because the food isn't just about the food. There's a whole chemical state change that's happening. There's all the habits that they started with as kids. There's all the forcing that happened. There's all the, you must clean your plate, or you mustn't, or you must try everything, or there's so many rules. And then there's rewarding with food. It's like, oh, you did a good job, have a chocolate biscuit. And all of this just creates stuff, is the best word, around this sort of thing. So to hear someone with dietitian training, as in, like, you're allowed to talk about food, but to say, like, it's not just about eating. In fact, eating is pretty much the last thing on the list when someone starts from resistance.
It's the lowest thing.
Lowest priority. Yeah.
And I love that you mentioned about rewards, because, you know, for better or worse, what I find for a lot of families who have a kiddo who is a picky eater, like, a desired food becomes the reward structure. And actually, kind of in relation to the rest of our conversation, a huge upgrade of rewards around food behaviors is connection, right? So if a child sits nicely at a mealtime, and normally things are flying everywhere and they're crying about what's on their plate or whatever it might be, if the reward is just language, like, oh my goodness, it's so fun having you sit here and we can chat at dinner, like, that is reinforcing the behavior that you want to see, and it's yours. They feel seen.
Yes.
They feel recognized. And then maybe if you're working toward trying a food and they smell it and then they lick it and then they whatever, like, you know, the whole process of trying, instead of a treat or something that's probably junk food being the reward around doing that, hey, if you know, give that food, you know, 3 smells, we're going to play a board game after dinner. That's a reward, because they're connected. And we think about where we learn emotional eating. Oh my gosh. Well, every time something went wrong, we were given a piece of chocolate or taking the ice cream or whatever. And it's like, well, it's pretty easy to see where we learn it.
And that whole essence of, like, oh, if you eat at least 6 mouthfuls of this food that you hate, you can have dessert. What? And especially that comes in when kids are at the time of learning theory of mind. So they're actually learning how to calculate and manipulate at the same time. And it's so interesting to see where this starts, because, you know, when I look really fundamentally at the family structure, the first thing is it's how you are with each other, how you hold each other, hug each other, with each other. And the second thing is how you eat together. And there is that sense of, like, just modeling behavior. And I used to deal a lot with kids with sensory disorders, and just saying to the parents, like, your job is to not be stressed around this mealtime, because your stress is undoubtedly, hands down, affecting the feeling that your child is having, irrespective of whether you're saying anything. So the only thing that we can do is create safety and see what happens. And slowing down all of the time horizons. I have a client I worked with for many years, and her kid had so many difficulties at birth, lots of problems and challenges, and developed really fussy eating. And he is the greatest kid. He is such a personality, such a character. And we started with exactly what you were saying, prodding the food, like feeling the texture, understanding what it was, like, you know, just getting close to it, just being around it. And it's like changing the landscape of what we think food is, because it is emotional. It is something we get to nourish ourselves with. So it has to be contextual.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I love you talking about connection.
All day, every day with it.
Yes.
Right? So we want to get that, I mean, I'm going to say relationship, and I know some people will not enjoy the food, that context. But I also think we're, like, out of our minds if we think we don't have relationships with food, because we are interacting with it all day, every day, thinking about it, preparing it. I mean, like, it hardly leaves our psyche. And so to set that relationship up in a positive way, you're not at war with food. You're not rewarded by food. Like, food is there for you to experience. And if it's good, awesome. If it's not your favorite, awesome. Like, just so much more relaxing around it would help a lot of kids.
Yeah, and just to speak to the relationship point, I'm personally of the philosophy that we have all of life is relational. We're in relationship with everything. So absolutely we have a relationship with food. And, I've had to work on mine for various reasons. And my listeners will know I had a lot of complex digestive problems, which were created by ruptured esophagus. So I've really seen how your entire approach to food changes when your body is not okay with it, and it becomes a complex, and it's something that I've had to work on, still have to work on. It's still easier for me not to eat, but you know what's the easiest time for me to eat? When other people are there and they want to break bread with me, to use a religious connotation, because it's like I'm not even thinking about the food because I'm with the people, and that is nourishing whilst I happen to be eating, and that is the safest place for me, especially when the other people are like connecting at eye level and really with me, like as humans. It's the easiest place, by far. Yeah. So I love that you speak about connection and rewarding with connection, because that is that's what kids crave, really. They crave time, just time from parents and from their loved ones. So.
And I think when kids are really young, they don't yet have the skills to distinguish like bad attention from good attention. And so even if you sit down to a meal and you're berating your child about how they're eating, that is input from you to them. And so they aren't distinguishing like, is that positive reinforcement? Does that feel good to me? Do I like that? They just know they're getting attention from you. Yeah. And a lot of times that can actually like massively escalate the issue, because it's actually reinforcing the issue rather than addressing the underlying concern.
Sure. And lead to problems later where that discernment between, and there's that whole kind of like familiarity with how you received love as a child. If you had difficulty distinguishing from the kind of lectures and the actual care, you end up with this very disorganized relationship to others, to love as a principle. And love is food, I believe. Like it's the same thing. It's the same energy. So I'm really delighted I asked you about that, because it's like, yeah. And just out of interest, like how did your son's sensory stuff develop? How did that kind of completely phase out? Is it something that still lives on? If you feel happy sharing, obviously.
Yeah. He ended up working with an occupational therapist for like 3 years. He had like really low vestibular processing, and so he needed his eyes for everything. Which is why food became such a huge problem, because as soon as it's in your mouth, you cannot see it anymore. And that made it feel very unsafe to him.
Interesting.
Yeah, super interesting. And so the occupational therapy was incredibly helpful. He made leaps and bounds just even during that time. But now he's 15, and that's been a real gift to him, that he had to learn how to regulate his nervous system, because now he's very skilled at it.
Yeah.
And he, it took some time for him to be like hopping in on, yeah, I'd love to try a new food. Like, that sounds amazing. But he just, he can eat me out of house and home now. So a very full recovery.
Right, absolutely. And just to add some context to that as well for our listeners and anyone who's been listening for a while. Stephen Porges, who developed polyvagal theory, has been doing work with something called the Safe Sound Protocol. And it's based on the vestibular of the inner ear with children with sensory processing difficulties, because in trauma, the ear will attune to high frequencies and low frequencies. It's literally trying to scan the periphery for danger, and you lose the middle frequency. And so a lot of the work that he's doing is about bringing that kind of literal capacity to sense into the middle frame without being at the extremes. And it is having massive difference in people with sensory processing difficulties and autism spectrum disorders. So hearing that about your son, it's like makes total sense how when, for any reason, trauma or not, or like just genetics, everything, the vestibular is oriented to the different end than where we feel safe, we will feel unsafe. It's inbuilt. So that's fascinating. Really interesting.
I'm so glad you shared that, because now I'll get to look more into that.
I will send you links to it, and I'll also pop links in the show notes to that, because it is very fascinating. I've decided to go to a conference in October all on kind of this and stuff, and I'm so excited because I worked with like gut biome issues with people with sensory processing difficulties for a long, long time. And I was always kind of sensing that I'm doing something, but I don't know that it's the whole thing. And but I used to refer to it as noise. And that's it. They're just hearing too much noise. And if they've kind of got gut biome disruption, it's putting too much noise into their nervous system on top of all of the environmental stuff. And so, yes, we can put darkened room and ear mufflers and all that kind of stuff. But how about we minimize the inner noise? Was my approach. Yeah. And now to hear these kind of theories about, well, actually they're just oriented to the wrong noises, wrong in inverted commas, but the world is fascinating. I love being in this space, like geeking out on all this stuff. So
yes.
So I love chatting to you. Is there anything else you feel like you would like to share with our listeners? Anything, any place you want to send them, any asks, requests, any thoughts that you would like to sort of conclude this episode with?
Yeah, for anyone who wants to find out more about what we're doing or the resources that we have, our website is thetotalpotential.com. Everything's there. So feel free to hop over there. And I think if I could leave with just one thing, it would just be like, ask yourself one question today, one new possibility, just get curious, because there's something really magical that's available in families, and it's not going to be available tomorrow by making one, consideration. But even if you could identify one place where it could feel better, there's massive unfolding that can happen just from that one point of interest. And so what is that for you? Because it's unique for everybody.
I love that. I love the kind of small, achievable, one step at a time, one difference essence. Yeah,
absolutely.
We will put all of your links in the show notes. I will link to your book on Amazon. I'm sure it's available on Amazon and all the places.
Yes.
I will put UK Amazon as well, if it's over there too, just to make sure that everyone can get it. And your website and all the things that you do on your social media profiles. Thank you so much for taking the time to chat to me today. I have really loved this. I've really kind of felt myself shift around the concept of family in the last kind of hour, which, job achieved. So thank you so much, Cole.
Well, I appreciate so much your curiosity, especially coming from a place where that isn't your point of reference. I just really appreciate, even starting to entertain what that is and what it looks like. I just appreciate the chance to chat about it and share.
Thank you. Thank you so much for spending the time. And I will encourage our listeners to go and find you and your brother and be involved in your work if they have families and they feel the call.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Unveil Podcast with Cole Berschback. You can find all of the links to Total Potential in the show notes. Please do go give Total Potential a follow on social media. And if you enjoyed this episode, please don't hesitate to send it to a friend who you feel might get value from what Cole had to say. All right, with that, just a quick reminder that the Unveil Academy Coach Training Certification course is still open for registration, but we are getting very close now to the time where the first founding member cohort year begins. If you are interested in becoming a holistic healing professional, please do check out the Unveil Academy now at unveilacademy.com/launch.